Herr Präsident.
Honourable Speaker, Federal President, Federal Chancellor, President of the Bundesrat, President of the Federal Constitutional Court, Excellencies, Mrs. Auerbacher, colleagues, guests. 80 years ago, on the 20th of January 1942, in a villa at Wannsee, 15 high-ranking civil servants and National Socialist Party officials met. The topic of the meeting was the final solution to the Jewish question. All those in attendance were aware of what this meant. The mass murder had commenced much earlier. The objective was to discuss how to make this mass murder systematic, accelerate it, and expand it to encompass the whole of Europe, to encompass 11 million Jews. None of the meeting's attendees registered any concerns. We remember the victims of the National Socialist crimes, the murdered Jews, the Sinti and Roma who died, the victims amongst the Slavic peoples. We remember the millions of people who were persecuted, dispossessed, humiliated, deprived of their rights, tortured or left to die because they thought differently, worshipped differently, loved differently, or because their lives were classified by the Nazis as unworthy. The Wannsee Conference stands for a state in which injustice was legalized, for a state which planned, organized, and administered the crime. This state was underpinned by individual people, people who became murderers and accomplices. So today is also a day of shame. Shame for what previous generations of Germans did. A shame never shown by the perpetrators. Far too few of them were held accountable by the courts. Far too many of them escaped with sentences so mild as to be an insult to the victims. And that included participants in the Wannsee Conference. My dear Ms. Auerbacher, you stand before us today as a witness of a time which, for most of us, is consigned to history. It seems far away and completely unimaginable. When you were 7 years old, you were deported with your parents to the Theresienstadt concentration camp. This was the day on which your childhood ended. Approximately 1.5 million Jewish children died in the Holocaust. And in one of your books, you write that you feel these 3 million eyes on you. And you appeal that they should not be forgotten. And making this appeal has become your vocation. Over the past years and decades, you've told your story on numerous occasions, particularly to children and young people, to ensure that they do not forget. I would like to thank you for making the trip from New York, and I know it was not easy, particularly under the difficult circumstances of the pandemic. So thank you for coming to speak to us today and telling us your story. We are honoured to have you here with us. When Inge Auerbacher's family received the so-called emigration order to deport them, her birthplace, Kippenheim, had already been declared in Nazi jargon to be free of Jews. Almost all of the Jews from Baden, the Palatinate and Saarland had been deported to the Gurs camp in the non-occupied part of France in October 1940. This was one of the first mass deportations of German Jews. And all of this took place in broad daylight. And, as the responsible officials duly reported back, it went off for the Main without incident. Today, the restored synagogue in Kippenheim is a remembrance education and meeting centre. It is run by citizens on a voluntary basis. And it is also thanks to the dedication of a local group that the house of Inge Auerbacher's grandparents in Jebenhausen was able to be preserved, and that today it is part of a path of remembrance commemorating former Jewish life in Göppingen. As a representative of all the dedicated local people, I would like to welcome the Mayor of Göppingen, Mr. Alex Meyer. Our culture of remembrance and commemoration is reliant on initiatives like this. It needs active citizens and associations which take care of remembrance sites, as well as school pupils who embark on voyages of discovery about the past. A culture of remembrance is not something which can be imposed from the top downwards, and it is not confined to state rituals like this annual act of remembrance, at least not in a free and democratic society. Remembrance evolves. With the passing of time, there are less and less witnesses able to give first-hand testimony. More and more people living here do not have German ancestors, and Germany's horrific 20th century history is not their history. That makes the work of schools, remembrance sites and museums all the more important. Our culture of remembrance, which has earned respect from many quarters, can only remain vibrant if we continually ask questions of our history and seek answers. And that applies particularly to young people. And it also means being able to accept different perspectives and discussing reference points of the histories of others, as long as we do this and the debates take place in a sensitive, responsible and respectful fashion. So I am particularly saddened by the fact that we have had to postpone the German Bundestag's youth encounter due to the pandemic. But of course we will reschedule it as soon as possible. The youth encounter brings together young people from different countries with different life experiences and different life stories. And they are united by one thing, by their belief that what happened must never be repeated. Anti-Semitism, misanthropy and racism have no place in our society, neither today nor in the future. Our country bears a special responsibility. The genocide of the European Jews is a German crime. Yet it is also a past which is relevant to all, not only Germans and not only Jews. And that is why the Bundestag, together with other European parliaments, is participating in the social media We Remember campaign. Together with many others worldwide, we are taking a stance on remembrance of the Holocaust, a stance against xenophobia and anti-Semitism. But merely taking a stance is not enough. I welcome the President of the Knesset, Mr. Miki Levy. It is a pleasure to have you with us today. And your visit underlines the close and special ties between the parliaments of our countries, 70 years after Konrad Adenauer and Ben Gurion signed the Luxembourg Agreement, which provided for reparations for something which cannot be repaired. Looking back, reconciliation between Germany and Israel seems miraculous, a precious gift which must be cultivated. Germany and Israel do not agree on everything, but they are nevertheless true partners, as emphasized by the then Israeli President Rivlin 2 years ago when he spoke here. We are united not least by the shared values to which we are committed and which are partly grounded in the lessons learnt from history. And that applies particularly to the battle against anti-Semitism. We in politics and society have been engaged in this battle for many years. We have created commissions and commissioners to deal with anti-Semitism, and we have innumerable civil society initiatives and groups. And we've tightened up provisions under criminal law. We warn of the dangers and make clear that anti-Semitism is not acceptable. Full stop, no matter how it is expressed. No matter where it comes from. Never again must anti-Semitic stereotypes and prejudice be allowed to take hold. Never again must Jews be made responsible for the evils of the world. Never again must anti-Semitism pave the way for exclusion, hatred, and a fanatical ideology of extermination. This ceremony of remembrance is also part of our commitment, because we remember in order to counter any threat of repetition, as stated in the original proclamation on this day of remembrance. Yet remembrance and commemoration do not create immunity to anti-Semitism, nor do they safeguard against racism and right-wing extremism. They did not prevent the murderous terrorism of the NSU, nor the anti-Semitic attack in Halle, nor the right-wing extremist murders in Hanau. And knowledge of history has not prevented 1/3 of the German population believing that the Jews might indeed have too great an influence, and has not prevented 70% of people from agreeing or partially agreeing that Israeli policy in the Middle East, and I quote, is as bad as that of the Nazis in the Second World War. And it has not prevented the pandemic from further stoking the hatred of Jews, which was already rife. So anti-Semitism is there, and it is to be found not only on the extreme margins, not only amongst intransigent diehards and a few anti-Semitic trolls on the internet. It is a problem of our society, of society as a whole. Anti-Semitism is to be found in our midst. We must ask ourselves honestly, including those of us who identify as committed anti-Semites, how free are we really from anti-Jewish cliches? Do we always manage not to hold Jews responsible for Israeli policy? And do misguided notions of tolerance lead us to be overly indulgent towards the anti-Semitism which some immigrants have brought with them from their own home countries? And do we actually notice the multifaceted German life, which fortunately once again exists in Germany? The diversity of contemporary Jewish life, encompassing German Jews and Jewish Germans, Orthodox and liberal Jews, young Israelis and Jewish families from the former Soviet Union. For the Jews do not exist, just as the Germans do not exist, the refugees or the Muslims do not exist. And, incidentally, anybody who incites hatred of Muslims and their faith undermines their own credibility as a friend of Judaism. Anybody who rejects people amongst us because they are different or simply because they've not always been here should certainly not use the word freedom in this context. Human dignity is inviolable, the dignity of every human. The lessons drawn from history shaped our constitution, and we know from experience that free societies remain vulnerable on the inside. So that is why we need courage to show intolerance towards those who want to use democracy to destroy it. And that is why we need that. Those are not my words. They are the drastic words of Carlo Schmitt, one of the architects of the German constitution, the Basic Law. Our liberal democracy must be able to defend itself against those who repeatedly invoke democracy, but actually only mean their own freedom, who emphasize their own right to tolerance while showing only contempt for pluralism, who spread lies in order to sow the seeds of doubt, incite hatred and violence, only to later distance themselves with expressions of outrage. The majority in our country has no time for this. They will not allow themselves to be enticed into violence. They vote democratically and debate democratically. And they are often passionate in these debates, sometimes even fierce. In our approach to the others, we need more courage to show intolerance, the resolute use of all means at the disposal of a resilient democracy. When right-wing extremists, historical revisionists, and ethno-nationalists celebrate election victories, it is not a warning sign. It is a sign that it is high time to take action. High time to stand together to defend the values and institutions of our free democratic society. For democracy bears no eternal seal. It is reliant on citizens who value it and bring it to life. And this is also one of the lessons which we are reminded of on this day and by German history. We are reminded that it is up to all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, a diverse culture which had grown over centuries was destroyed by murderous German fanatical racism. This impoverished Europe. Scientists, intellectuals, and artists were forced out, went into exile, lost their lives. One of them was the composer from Prague, Hans Krása. His children's opera Wunderbar was misused by the Nazis for their propaganda in Theresienstadt concentration camp. It was there that Hans Krása also wrote the string trio piece that we are about to hear. He died in 1944 in Auschwitz. I would like to thank the musicians from the Prague operas. I would like to thank Joet, the cantor, and I would also like to thank all the other musicians and artists who have been involved in this ceremony of remembrance. After the music is finished, Ms. Auerbacher, you have the word. You have the floor. Thank you very much.
Guten Morgen.
Good morning. Madam President of the Bundestag, Mrs. Bas, Mr. Speaker of the Knesset, Mr. Levy, Dr. Schäuble, members of the German Bundestag, guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. So, who am I? I am a Jewish girl from the village of Kippenheim in Baden and from Jebenhausen-Göppingen in Swabia. I was born on December the 31st, 1934 in Kippenheim. Jews and Christians lived together in peace. I was the last Jewish child to be born there, the only child of Berthold and Regina Auerbacher. Papa served in the German army in World War I and was badly wounded. He was a decorated soldier. He was awarded the Iron Cross. By profession, he was a textile merchant. Mama was from Jebenhausen in Swabia. Her mother, my grandma, was from a large family. She was one of 14 children. 4 of her brothers fought in World War I, and 2 of them gave their lives to the German fatherland. My grandma of blessed memory was murdered by the Nazis. She is buried in a mass grave in Birkeniki forest near Riga in Latvia. Berthold Auerbach, his real name was Moses Baruch Auerbacher, was a member of my family, one of my relatives, and in the 19th century he was a celebrated writer. Today there is a street named after him in Berlin. New York has been my home for 75 years, but I still have very clear memories of that dark time, a time of terror and hate. Sadly, this cancer has returned, and hatred of the Jews has become commonplace again in many countries of the world, including Germany. This disease needs to be eradicated as swiftly as possible. We were a happy little community in Kippenheim until something happened to disturb the peace of our quiet village. On November the 9th and 10th, 1938, riots and violence erupted against the Jewish people across Germany. Today, those events are known as the Night of Broken Glass. In Kippenheim, there was a pogrom on November the 10th. I was not even 4 years old at the time. Nazi hoodlums threw bricks through our windows. I was nearly hit by one of those stones. Our synagogue was not burnt down. There were Christian houses in the neighborhood, and there was a risk that they might catch fire as well. All men and boys from the age of 16 were sent to concentration camps. My grandpa and papa were deported to the concentration camp at Dachau, where they were held in Block 16. Weeks later, they were released and came back home. They told us terrible stories of the torture and abuse they had suffered. It was quite clear that it was time to leave Germany. We sold our house in Kippenheim in 1939, and Papa lost his business. We moved in with my grandparents in Jebenhausen, hoping that we would soon be able to emigrate. But where to? The doors for emigration were closing very rapidly. Soon afterwards, my grandpa died of a broken heart. New anti-Semitic laws and decrees were being issued all the time, all targeting the Jews. And yet, many of the residents of Jebenhausen remained our loyal friends, even though it was forbidden for Christians and neighbors to have any contact with Jews. Some of the farmers sometimes gave us food as well. And most children still played with me. Then I turned 6, and it was time for me to go to school. By now, Jewish children were not allowed to attend the local public school anymore. I had to walk the 3 kilometers to Göppingen, and then spend 1 hour on the train to Stuttgart, where there was a Jewish school. It was the only Jewish school in the region. I had to get special permission to travel, as Jews no longer had any freedom of movement. At first, my father took me to school. Later, my parents had to work as slave laborers in a factory in Göppingen, and so I traveled to school on my own. The journey to school became even more dangerous after September the 1st, 1941, as all Jews aged 6 and over had to wear the yellow star. I was taunted and harassed by some of the Christian children. One day, a woman left a little bag of bread rolls right next to my seat. She must have seen that I was wearing the yellow star and felt some compassion for the little Jewish girl who was sitting all alone on the train. The deportations to the east began at the end of 1941. My grandma and most of the children from the Jewish school were deported to Riga in Latvia. The school in Stuttgart was soon forced to close, before I could finish first grade. We had to leave my grandparents' house in Jebenhausen and move into a Jewish house in Göppingen. In August 1942, my parents and I and other Jews were told to assemble in the school gymnasium at the Schillerschule in Göppingen. All our belongings were searched. One of the guards saw that I was wearing a little wooden pin, which he liked the look of, and he tore it off me. In a harsh voice, he told me, "You won't need this where you're going." It sounds a bit different in Swabian. He said it in Swabian. And I had my doll in my arms, and he ripped her from me too, and looked inside her hollow body to see if I was hiding anything there. There were tears streaming down my face. I was so happy when he handed Marlene, my doll, back to me. From Göppingen, we were sent to the Killersberg transit camp in Stuttgart. Then, on August the 22nd, 1942, we were put on a transport made up of Jewish people from Württemberg and sent to the Theresienstadt or Terezin concentration camp. I was 7 years old at the time, the youngest in the transport of around 1,100 Jews. My parents and I were among the very few who survived. We were on the train for about 2 days. It was still a passenger train, very crowded, and finally we arrived at the station in Auschwitz. The first thing we heard were the guards yelling at us, "Drop everything except your bedroll and metal dishes. Get going. March. Do as you're told." We were surrounded by guards with whips. My parents put me between them, so I was protected from the blows. I was holding on to my doll for dear life. We walked about 3 kilometers. For the older people, it was a very long and difficult journey on foot. Finally, we passed through an entrance arch into a garrison, very large. Our quarters were located on the top story. We had no beds, there was just the cold floor. It was very, very overcrowded. Theresienstadt, or Terezin, consisted of vast red brick barracks and old run-down houses. The concentration camp was totally sealed off from the outside world by high walls, wooden fences and barbed wire. Contact with anyone outside was strictly forbidden. On October the 10th, 1941, Reinhard Heydrich, Adolf Eichmann and other Nazi high-ups had decided that Theresienstadt should serve as a transit camp for Jews before they were sent onwards to their deaths. In 1944, the Nazis beautified the camp for propaganda purposes and called it a model ghetto. It was all for show, an elaborate hoax staged solely for the inspection by the International Red Cross. The camp inmates came from all over Europe. They were older people, prominent people, and many were highly decorated veterans of World War I. Life in the Theresienstadt concentration camp was especially difficult for such a young child. There was no escape. There were only the gas chambers at Auschwitz, starvation, suicide, or death from disease. Most families, men, women, and children, had to live separately from one another, but they could still see each other. Luckily, I was allowed to stay with my parents in the quarters assigned to the disabled war veterans. We slept on sacks of straw, crowded together on 2- or 3-tier bunks. We children became independent very quickly. The most important words in our vocabulary were bread, potatoes, and soup. Life revolved entirely around food. The bathrooms were just latrines far away. Very occasionally, we were allowed to take a shower. Our playground was a foul-smelling garbage dump. We rummaged around here for hours, hoping to find a treasure. A rotten turnip, or some potato skin. If it was still edible, we would cut a little bit off to eat. School was forbidden for us children. Classes were held in secret, and we were taught some basic reading and writing skills. This was called keeping ourselves busy. I made a bed for my doll out of a dirty cardboard box, which I kept at the end of the top bunk where I slept alongside my parents. One day, I found a dead mouse in the box. Another victim of starvation. There were frequent epidemics caused by the lack of sanitation and the overcrowded conditions that we had to live in. Typhus was one of the worst dangers we faced. Rats, mice, fleas, lice, and bedbugs, those were our constant companions. There were also frequent deportations, mostly to Auschwitz. In 1944, all the disabled war veterans had to report in alphabetical order to the commandant's office. They had no idea that this was a selection for deportation to Auschwitz. We shared our room with a family named Abraham from Berlin. They had a daughter, Ruth Nellie, who was exactly my age and who was an only child, just like me. Her father had been wounded in World War I and walked with a limp. So both our fathers were summoned to the commandant's office at the same time. A few weeks later, all 3 members of the Abraham family were deported to the east. By a miracle, we were left behind. Ruth and I were like sisters, and we promised to visit each other. She would come to Jebenhausen, and I would go to Berlin. Dear Ruth, I am here in Berlin. I have come to visit you. Ruth and her parents were murdered in the gas chambers in Auschwitz. She didn't even make it to her 10th birthday. On the 8th of May 1945, we were liberated by the Russian army, and our misery finally ended. Out of the 140,000 people who were sent to Theresienstadt, 33,000 died there, and 88,000 were murdered, mostly in Auschwitz or at other camps. "15,000 children passed through the Theresienstadt camp, and very few of them survived. Miraculously, I am one of them. Let me add something. I'm wearing a butterfly here today, and it's not only a piece of jewelry. A Czech boy, Pavel Friedman, wrote a poem in Terezin. He wrote, "I never saw a butterfly again." And this symbol, the butterfly, is a symbol for the 1.5 million Jewish children who were killed. So we always wear this butterfly. And I'm wearing it today, especially here at the German Bundestag. the city of Stuttgart sent a bus to pick up the few survivors. We went back to Göppingen, but only stayed there for 9 months. In May 1946, we emigrated to New York. I was 11 years old. My parents found work with a well-to-do family, my mother as a maid and my father as a butler. To me, America felt like Wonderland. Sadly, though, my dream was about to end. I had a very bad cough, so I was taken to the doctor. After he examined me, he told my parents, "Your daughter is very sick. She has tuberculosis in both lungs. She has to go to hospital right away." The doctor told my parents that the disease was caused by the 3 years in the concentration camp, where I had been undernourished and lived in filthy conditions. I was placed in a community hospital. I could hardly believe it. I thought, I am being locked up again. This can't be true. My face was awash with tears. I had to spend 2 years in bed and undergo painful medical examinations. Finally, my parents said it's enough. They had found an apartment in Brooklyn by that time, and they took me home. Within a few months, however, I was in an even worse state than before, with bleeding in my lungs and very weak. I prayed to God, "Please, don't let me die. I want to live." By a miracle, a new drug came out, streptomycin, the first antibiotic that was effective against tuberculosis. A Nobel Prize was awarded for its discovery. I had to stay in bed for another year, but I was so thankful because those painful injections of streptomycin cured me. Finally, aged 15, I started school, and I finished high school in 3 instead of 4 years. I was very interested in science, so I went to college to study chemistry. After a few years, I got sick again. I had to spend another 12 months in bed and take 26 pills a day and 2 shots of streptomycin. Then, at last, I went back to college and completed my studies. For 38 years, I pursued a career as a chemist in medical research and clinical work. To sum up, as far as I know, I am the only child survivor who was deported from Stuttgart to the concentration camps. 20 members of our family were murdered by the Nazis. I spent 3 years in the Theresienstadt concentration camp. I endured 4 years of bed rest due to the severe effects this had on my health. I lost 8 years of schooling and suffered 4 years of stigmatization from having to wear a yellow star, as well as stigma because of the pernicious disease which deterred partners from marrying me. I never got to wear a wedding dress. I will never be a mum or a grandma. But I'm happy. The children of the world are my family. I would like to conclude by sharing what my heart desires the most. Hatred against people is terrible. We are all born as brothers and sisters. My greatest wish is reconciliation among all people. So light a candle today to remember the murdered, innocent children, women, and men. Light a candle to celebrate life and hold back the darkness. Take care of your sisters and brothers, then you will always be blessed. We are all born as children of God. The gates to unity and peace are opening. The past must never be forgotten. Together, let us pray for unity on earth. Together, let us welcome a new tomorrow. And never, never, never lose sight of this dream. Thank you very much.
Ich blase im Ghetto von Gessel zu Gessel und kenn nicht gefinnen, kein Ort. Nicht treu ist mein Liebe, wie trock meiner Riebe. Menschen, o so krotsch, a Wort. Es leucht auf mein Heimitz, der Himmel, der Bläue, was hab ich jetzt erfüllt? Ich steh wie ein Bettler, bei jedem Teuer und bettel a bissele Sonn. Oi, oi. Israel zurück. Frieden auf deine Flügelbläue und nimm mein Herz mit und bring es zu mein Glück. Frieden auf deine Flügelbläue und nimm mein Herz mit und bring es zu mein Glück. Es ist ja der Frühling ob früh und gekommen, zerbläht hat sich Bänkschaft noch dir. Ich seh dich wie jetzt der Ballon mit Blumen, auf Rediger gehst du zu mir. Die Sonne hat vergossen dem Weltheit mit Strahlen, zerstört so die Erde in Grün. Mein Treier, mein Liebster, wo bist du verfahren? Du gehst nicht heraus von mein Sinn. Frieden. Und bring mein Liebsten zu mein Glück, Frühling auf deine Flügelbläue und nimm mein Herz mit und bring es zu mein Glück. Sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst im letzten Weg, Gott schimmeln bläene, verstellen bläue Tag. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebeckte Show, das Wetter beugt an unser Trott, wir sehnen da. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebeckte Show, das Wetter beugt an unser Trott, wir sehnen da. Von grünen Palmenland bis Land von weißen Schnee, wir kommen an mit unser Pein, mit unser Weh. Und wohlgefallen ist ein Spritz von unser Blut, sprotzen wird dort unser Gwure, unser Mut. Und wohlgefallen ist ein Spritz von unser Blut, sprotzen wird dort unser Gwure, unser Mut. Das Lied geschrieben ist mit Blut und nicht mit Blei. Es ist nicht kein Lied von a Vogel läuft der frei. Das hat a voll zwischen Fallen dick gewähnt. Das Lied gesungen mit na Ganges in die Hände. Kommen wird dort unser ausgeweckte Show. Das Wetter beugt an unser Trott. Wir sehnen da.
גברתי נשיאת הבונדסטאג, הגברת בס, אדוני נשיא גרמניה, שטיינמאייר, אדוני קנצלר גרמניה, שולץ, גברתי שורדת השואה, בת עמי, אינגה אורבכר, מוזמנים, אורחים, מכובדיי כולם. אני עומד מולכם היום נרגש ומלא ענווה. ביום השואה הבינלאומי, יום ההנצחה לקורבנות הנציונל סוציאליזם. גאה לייצג את המדינה.
It is on this day of remembrance of the victims of National Socialism that I stand before you today with humility and with great emotion, and I'm proud to do so as a representative of the State of Israel, as Speaker of the Knesset, the Israeli Parliament, the beating heart of Israeli democracy. And President of the Bundestag, I would like to begin by thanking you for the invitation to speak today. Thank you for the invitation to take part in this ceremony today, which takes place on the day of the liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau liberation camp, on this universal day of remembrance, where we remember the most terrible events in human history. Here, in this very place, in this historic building, it is possible, perhaps at least to some degree, to try and understand or grapple with the capacity of humans to use democracy itself to destroy democracy. It is here in this place where the limits of evil were expanded. It is a place where values were lost and where the democratic framework descended into racist tyranny. So it is here, anew, within the walls of this building, which stand as silent stone and still witnesses, we remember anew how fragile democracy is. And we are reminded of our duty to protect it at all cost. Ladies and gentlemen, keeping alive remembrance of the Holocaust is a difficult task, a task which must be shouldered by every generation anew. This task of passing on knowledge of the horrendous events of the past to future generations. And when remembering the Holocaust, often huge figures are cited. They are incomprehensible statistics often. But can a figure like 6 million be communicated in any way? And the sheer scale of this number creates a certain distance. And this does a disservice to the victims and survivors of the Holocaust, because it further dehumanizes them. The 6 million Jews murdered are 6 million individual stories, stories of lives not lived, stories of lives of people who are no longer with us. So, Inge Auerbacher, I have the deepest of respect for you. You have described your memories of the Holocaust, and in doing so, you have created a clear and unusual voice. This voice which shows the power of a human story to really get into people's hearts and to communicate in such a poignant way. How else would it be possible to understand this message? The fact that a girl was only able to be a girl for 7 years before she was deported to a concentration camp. It is impossible to comprehend that a childhood is stolen from a girl in this way. Her family dignity was stolen from her. I would like to thank you, Inge. Thank you for managing to make the incomprehensible comprehensible. Thank you for sharing your personal story with us, indeed with the whole of the world. In order for memories of the Holocaust to be passed on to future generations. Ladies and gentlemen, the decisions which changed Inge's life were taken 80 years and 7 days ago, not far from here in the Wannsee villa. I was able to visit this grandiose villa yesterday, and it rendered me speechless. I felt the incredible discrepancy between the innocuous flower beds, the lake shimmering beyond, and the terrible cruelty which was planned here in this place, the machinery conceived to annihilate European Jewry. The blood-chilling Wannsee Conference was intended to coordinate the different areas to achieve the overarching goal of the Nazi regime, which was to extinguish every memory of the Jewish people. This was annihilation and mass murder which was planned in advance, which stemmed from inexplicable hatred and was carried out in a systematic fashion. 80 years and 7 days are nothing in historical terms, but they are not enough to heal all wounds. There are many wounds which have still not been healed. Many people still carry those wounds, and indeed those wounds will never be able to be healed. Ladies and gentlemen, the work of remembrance unites our peoples, the Israeli and the German people. So we have remembrance, but we also have a recreation, a rebuilding. Over these 80 years and 7 days, our two countries have been successful in rising again from these national traumas and to create something new. Two nations hovering between death and life, and two nations choosing life every day anew. I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that thou may live. This is from the 5th book of Moses, chapter 30, verse 19. So these two countries have embarked on an unusual journey on the path to reconciliation and consolidating their relations. On the basis of a courageous friendship, Germany and Israel have built a bridge, and we believe in the strength and importance of democracy and in the absolute necessity of working to preserve this democracy again and again. People-to-people ties are fostered in the cultural and creative field, in technology, innovation, trade, science, academia, in medicine. We work together and we cooperate in the security and intelligence fields, and we have important and far-reaching cooperation between our two parliaments, which we have developed. Germany has made responsibility for the security of Israel one of the cornerstones of our foreign policy. Germany stands steadfast against anti-Semitism, including in the form of anti-Zionism. And in bilateral and international forums, Germany has proved again and again its awareness of the moral and historical responsibility it has for the existence and security of the State of Israel. Our relations are based on trust, honesty, and solidarity. And this allows us to tackle challenges being faced by our two countries, and indeed challenges being faced by humanity as a whole. We can tackle those challenges together. Those challenges include the coronavirus and all its variants, but also the climate change crisis, which is posing a challenge to the whole of the world. I would like to say thank you once again to the previous Federal Chancellor, Angela Merkel, for all of this. She only recently retired from her long term in office. She has consolidated Germany's strength and has worked untiringly in consolidating relations between our two countries. So thank you very much, Angela Merkel. Ladies and gentlemen, Federal Chancellor Olaf Scholz, the State of Israel is counting on you. And we know that you will continue this tradition which has been developed over so many years. And we know that we will continue to work on the relations between our peoples and states. Ladies and gentlemen, we have done a great deal, yet we still have a responsibility to do even more. And we retain this remembrance in order to support humanity in the future and for eternity. In the end, however, we need to create a vision from this remembrance. We need to plan a future together with hope, which is based on shared values and shared dreams. We must bring together our young children, the generation of the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the third and fourth generations, and all those generations still to come. We must encourage them to work together in the interests of a history full of inspiration and founded on the values of democracy, freedom, and tolerance. These are values which Germany and Israel share. We must foster the good in our young men and women. We must warn them against hating others simply because they are different. The eternal and terrible warning of the Holocaust of the European Jews is never again. Never again. Ladies and gentlemen, 80 years and 7 days ago, they wanted to annihilate the Jewish people. Since then, our people has risen once again. We have an independent state, our historic homeland, the State of Israel. Today we want to remember, we will always remember, and we want together to build a bright future. And before I finish, I would like here in this place to remember the dead. I will read an excerpt from the Kaddish prayer, the Jewish prayer which honors the souls of the deceased. I will read the Kaddish from a Jewish prayer book, which I borrowed specially for today from the Yad Vashem Holocaust Remembrance Center. This prayer book was used by a Jewish German boy at his bar mitzvah on the 22nd of October 1938, shortly before the November pogrom, also known as Kristallnacht. Shortly before that life that he was meant to live was shattered by reality in Germany. This prayer book, which against the background of the atrocities of the Holocaust, bore silent witness, like the walls of stone and steel of this building. So I will now read the Kaddish prayer for Israel.
יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמת יברך קירותי, וימליך מלכותי, ויצמח פורקנה, ויקרב משיחי, בחיי חון וביום חון, ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא ברחמיו יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל עמו ישראל, ואמרו אמן. תודה רבה. תודה רבה לכם. תודה. Thank you very much.